Does anybody recognize this?
The Tank Man?
From what? Do you know what event it is? Tiananmen Square. 1989, China, the communist government fired on protesters in the capital city of Beijing. Death estimates range from several hundred to several thousand, with approximately 14,000 additional injured civilians. Probably not many of you know what this picture is. We got some lovely tear gas going on in the background. This is Hong Kong 3 weeks ago. They're having protests over how China is enacting its basic law policy, and what not many people know is that Hong Kong has a whole history of protests, specifically against the central government of China on the mainland of Beijing. And this goes back to, real quick, for those of you who don't know, Hong Kong is right down here. Oops. Looks like it's connected to mainland China on that map, but it's actually a small little island over here. Now, Tiananmen Square in 1989. Hong Kong was still under British occupation at the time, so it belonged to the United Kingdom. In 1987, Britain came out and said that they were going to transfer Hong Kong back to the Chinese government. 2 years later, Tiananmen Square happened, and it sparked the biggest protest. I actually have a quote here by Ming Sing in the Journal of Contemporary China in 2006. The stale of the July 1st rally in 1989 in Hong Kong is still thought to be maybe the biggest in Chinese history. Unfortunately, there are no pictures. So, those protests did nothing. In 1997, Britain signed over Hong Kong to China, and all parties together came together and wrote the Basic Law of Hong Kong. This is kind of their constitution. This is what gives the British control over, the Chinese control over the District of Hong Kong. And this is what sparked all the protests from then until the present. 2003, excellent peaceful protest. The first time that Hong Kong was able to successfully get China to back down on their policies. The Basic Law of Hong Kong states that courts can interpret the basic law, but the China central government has ultimate power. Now, how they've put this into practice is Beijing has constantly tried to narrow the definitions of what's actually allowed by the governor of Hong Kong when they act independently of the Chinese government. In 2003, as a brief history of protest in Post-Handover Hong Kong tells us, which was published this year, the legislation prohibited treason, secession, and subversion, all of which was up to Beijing's interpretation. So the Hong Kong people didn't like that at all, and they took to the streets. 2014, this is the first time that Hong Kong police opened fire on protesters in the Admiralty Way in front of the central government building. This time, China was trying to enact legislation that would allow them to nationalize education, which basically means make it more communist, make it more friendly to mainland China. In 2019, which is this year, it all started with a man and his girlfriend who went to Taiwan, and while there, the man murdered his pregnant girlfriend in cold blood. He then went back to Hong Kong and was arrested for minor crimes. The Chinese government took this opportunity to tighten their hold on Hong Kong, so to speak, and passed a law that said that any criminal at any time can be extradited to Hong Kong, from Hong Kong to a friendly territory. How they practiced this was any journalist that fell into the category of sedition, like that law that they enacted in 2003 said, they could extradite them to China. 72 journalists have been extradited, and none have been heard from since. So, 3 days ago, the Chinese government came out and issued a statement saying that they were going to expand the basic law to cover more stringent protocol in choosing the governor of Hong Kong, basically allowing them to put a leader in that they feel is patriotic and represents Chinese mainland interests. Now, probably none of you care about all the information that I just splurged at you, but in these protests, America has become an icon of actual democracy, which is what the people of Hong Kong are fighting for. According to Christina Lin from the Asian Times, August 21st of this year, many protesters have been seen waving American flags and singing the American national anthem. Now, unfortunately, there have also been 72 deaths that have occurred as a result of these protests this year alone. So just think about what America represents and think about how it's being reflected all over the world, and just consider how we can be an icon of freedom and democracy.
Okay. Galen, how did it go?
Absolutely terrible.
Okay.
I didn't have enough time to practice the speech because I have a midterm today as well. That's worth a lot of my grade in a different class, so my time was kind of split, and I didn't have enough time to rehearse this. I didn't really have enough time to get my information down how I wanted it. There was a lot more information that I felt I couldn't fit into my speech time. So yeah.
Okay. All right. Audience, if you could please offer some feedback.
I think your speech didn't come off as like unpracticed. It came off as very conversational, and you did seem rather informed, despite not practicing, because you didn't look down at your notes to like read facts. You like knew it from your brain, which I think is pretty impressive.
Yeah, I was gonna agree with Natalie. You just seem really like knowledgeable about the topic, and I think it really showed through your eye contact with the audience and your conversational tone, and just you had a really loud, clear-speaking voice and enunciated really well through the whole thing.
I thought your visual aid was really good. It was just very simple, but the images were powerful, and I liked how you had that timeline in the top right.
Galen, interesting topic to select in terms of Hong Kong. I know when I was old enough to remember when they decided to give Hong Kong back to China. And I wasn't 5, and it was pretty controversial at the time. And there were questions, and rather than giving it back to China, why not just make it its own sovereign state? I mean, there was a huge controversy around this. And so, knowing sort of the timeline that you walked us through, I think sort of helps give us some information about that process. I might say. I like the timeline too. I thought that was a clever way to sort of keep us on track and sort of know when your points were. Just make sure you're using language and kind of, I would say maybe in your introduction, highlight that you're going to be walking us through the chronology of how things have happened. So then that way at least we hear it and we can kind of know what we're going to be listening for. Does that make sense? Okay. Be sure to establish your credibility early on. The one thing I would say is be careful. Sometimes you use language like, I'm sure you all don't know. And so you want to be careful with assuming what your audience knows and doesn't know. So just be attentive to that language as you speak. Would be a suggestion for you. I did hear some citations, and I think that what you incorporated, I think, was beneficial for what you were talking about. I thought the slides were good. In terms of what they were showing and what you were talking about and illustrating. I would probably, once you sort of finish talking us through what it was is on the screen, though, just go ahead and go to a blank slide. And see if that's perfectly okay. Conversationally, you have you have a degree of comfort just going up there and talking. And that's, you have the capacity to just come across conversationally as you're speaking. And it's really, truly a benefit for you so that you don't feel like you get tripped up on what you have in front of you. a manuscript or whatnot. So continue to work with that. Just practice that a little bit more so we get that smoothness out. Have those structural elements be a little cleaner. I did hear a conclusion this time.
I know. I had wrote the whole thing and forgot to add a conclusion. I was like, oh, she's going to dog me for that because I've done that before. So.
I one of the things that you did later on in the speech, as opposed to sort of at the beginning, was you might have highlighted what you highlighted, or you made a statement about why why we should even care about this, right? Sort of what's at stake when you talk about democracy? What's at stake when you have a republic and a constitution? When you start having protests and people try to erode that away, right?
Well, an issue I ran into with this speech was that any one of my points could have been a whole 8-minute speech in and of itself once I started to research it.
Yeah.
So there was a lot, especially last night at like 11 p.m., there was a lot of like trimming and cutting because I did my whole speech and it was like 14 minutes. So I was like, that's enough.
Yeah. And really, truly, going back to that specific purpose statement, I think if you really hone in on that, that can help sort of narrow that down.